Hi, Andreas from Totle here, and today I want to show you a little bit about how we're building Totle in Totle. So the specific feature I want to build today is a request we got from Patrick from our community, and he would really like if we could make the properties panel wider, or I think in this case at least allow you to resize it. And the specific example he has here is, if you can see, he's got an attribute with a really long name, and it kind of doesn't leave much room for the value, right? I think that makes a ton of sense. I don't really want to make the attribute panel wider because I think, especially for smaller screens, it already takes up a good amount of space, and in most of the cases, it's just fine. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to make it resizable. So we're going to call it right panel. Resize. Oops, there we go. If I can spell. So I just created a new branch in the Totle project that allows me to get started. And actually, quite luckily, we happen to be open right on the component we were looking for, right? Because we can see here on the left, we already have a resize option for the left panel. So we don't need to do everything from scratch, right? And you can resize it quite hard. We don't need to do everything from scratch. We just kind of need to duplicate the same behavior on the right. And so the first thing I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take a look at what are we doing on the left, how does that work, and how much of that logic and those components can I reuse on the right side, right? So we have this little bar here on the right, this little handle, and we can actually see if we hover the mouse. It's like we can't see it by default because it's kind of hidden, always just hovering at the edge of the panel here, right? But once you hover it, once you get your mouse close to the edge, it sort of lights up with a resize handle, right? And we can see that's the one that's right here. It's called a Totle panel resizer, right? And let's double click into that and see, okay, so we've got that here. We go into test mode, we can see, oh, there it is. And the way it works, we can start inspecting it. We've got a, oh, let's just kill that button. We can see we've got event on this one. Let's inspect. Okay, so what we're doing is when we're pressing the mouse down, we're setting a variable called cursor state, which we have here. Right. Okay, and we can see cursor state has like an X position, so that's X is like the left-right direction, right? Y is up down. So an X initially is 0, which is all the way to the left, and then width property of 400 and pressed is 4. Okay, so this variable contains some data. Let's try and see what's supposed to happen when we press down. So we'll open this formula and say, okay, so when we press down, we're going to go and update that variable with a new object containing all this data. It's going to have our X value where we press down the button. So this is the X, here's the X value where we press down the mouse button, right? It's going to have the width, which is it takes from an attribute, and then set press to true. Okay, so this whole variable, the cursor state, is kind of keeping track of what is the current position, I think, of the mouse, the current state of this whole cursor dragging thing, right? And if it's not pressed, we basically don't really care about it, right? Okay, so that somewhat makes sense. If it doesn't all make sense to you yet, that's fine. It's kind of big. It's a bigger picture. We'll go through the whole thing, right? So, and then we have these two. Like that's the whole panel. That's also the one that's kind of hidden there. Then we've got this div here, which has a hover and a dot pressed. Okay, so these are just kind of drawing the UI of the handle and the bar around it, right? So we don't really care too much about those to do right now. We care only about the functionality. The styling is kind of already done, so we don't really need to dive into it, right? Okay, so then we've got this top layer component. So this is a component that exists in the Totle project. We've built that for basically making our life a bit easier. And what it does is that it moves the content inside it into what's called the top layer in CSS. It basically creates a dialog and puts it in full screen. And the point of doing that is it guarantees that no matter where you put this, it's always going to be on top of anything else. And we can see if we look at the show formula, like this is actually the first time I'm diving through this component, but usually you can kind of predict how things work once you've spent a little time with it, right? So we can see this basically says if the cursor state is pressed, show this dialog. So why are we doing that, right? What's the point of this? That when we click on this one, when we click the mouse down on it, we actually put a top layer dialog on top of the whole screen. Why would we do that? And the answer to that is probably hitting here in the event. That's not the one, because that's a closed event. We'll try inside here. This div that takes up the full screen. That's where the magic happens, right? Because here we've got a mouse move and a mouse up event. And so the mouse move triggers an event that says on change, right? Okay, so now the pieces of the pictures are sort of starting to fall in. We've got a panel here, right? When we click the mouse down on it anywhere, we actually change the internal state of this. It changed the variable to saying, hey, now you're pressed. As long as it's pressed, because we can just show here, quick, the mouse up sets the cursor state, and we can predict that it sets it to false, right? It does. It says this back to false, right? And when it says this back to false, it means you mouse up, the top layer is no longer be pressed and it's going to hide. So essentially this top layer with this whole div, this whole part is only going to be shown on the screen while the mouse is down, right? And what it essentially solves one problem, which is it becomes this panel where we can listen for mouse move, right? And allows us to trigger this change all the way up. And let's have a look at this. The brief version of what this does is it basically says what should the new width of the panel be based on where you're dragging the mouse. And what it's doing is it's taking the current X position of the mouse, subtracting the last X position of the mouse, right? And then it's adding width, which basically saying the current width of the panel plus however much the mouse moved in either direction, which will then be plus or minus and then, right? I hope that makes sense. If it can get a little bit complicated. It's kind of mathy, right? But hopefully you follow this. Otherwise, we'll show it a few more times as we're duplicating, right? Okay, so here we have this min width and max width. These are attributes passed into this component, and it basically lets you go and say, never go smaller than this, never go larger than this, right? And we can simply fix that just by using this clamp. Clamp says, use this value, but unless it's smaller than this or larger than this, like puts a minimum and maximum in, right? It's quite a useful one to use. Okay, so we're beginning to see what's going on, right? We've got a width that changes over time, and then or that we change as we're dragging it. When we are pressing this down, we're showing a big top layer that then captures our mouse movement. So one relevant question might be, why do we need this full screen top layer? Why couldn't we just do the mouse move here? And the answer is actually surprisingly annoying. But when you do like fast mouse movements, it's quite likely, especially let's say we end up pressing a little bit near the edge of this, right? It's quite likely that if I'm dragging my mouse quickly, I'm gonna end up maybe triggering one mouse move event inside, but the mouse, like the browser only samples as fast as it can. You can move faster than the browser can sort of sample your mouse movement. And as a result, it might fire one mouse move event inside, but it'll probably fire the next one outside. And then if the mouse is not actually over the element when you're moving it, it's not going to trigger that event. So if we try to put the mouse move event on this Totle panel resize element we put in the Totle in the top, it wouldn't actually trigger. So that's why we need this top layer. All it does is basically takes up the whole screen, and it now becomes like a mouse move listener and also mouse up. And so this basically allows us to get this feature here where I can drag it really aggressively And that's okay, because the actual listener right now is on top of the whole screen. Now I don't see that, because the second I let go of it, it disappears and I can interact with the screen again. But if you had like 2 mice or something, right, you would actually realize that right now you wouldn't be able to click on anything else, because you're dragging this, and we're actually putting an invisible element over the whole screen. This is a nice little trick of doing that. It's not the only way of doing it. Like there's, in code, you would often like put these mouse listeners on the body of the whole thing. But that comes with its own kind of problems. So this kind of just putting an element on top that fills the whole screen is actually quite a useful way of accomplishing like these big sort of cross-page mouse interaction events. Right. So now we kind of get how it works, because, it captures it. That's pretty good. So the question is then, we basically have 2 options, because this one is sort of built to work with the left side. And you can see this because when we drag the mouse, all the math here is working towards the left side, right? We're taking the difference in the here in the position and changing it based on the x position, right? If we were to do this on the right side, the math would be opposite, right? So if I'm on the left side and I'm moving the mouse towards the right, I'm making the panel larger. If I'm on the right side and moving the mouse to the right, I'm making the panel smaller. So this doesn't quite work, right? We kind of have to change this the other way around. It should actually be the opposite here. So the question then becomes like this. There's essentially 2 things we could do here, and I think actually, if I'm not, we have a width that's okay. So this is actually like absolute positioned. We can see this here, right? And with a left property that's defined by the width. What that means is that this doesn't live inside of the left panel. It actually lives next to it. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. I can kind of show that if we go back to the project sidebar, right? That's where we have it. If we see this, this is actually, I'm just going to move myself over here. This is actually all the way down here. If we just collapse all these, we can see we've got like the project sidebar. We got this this left side, the actual menu bar here, and then we've got this pop-up part, right? We've got some more dialogues and different things, and then we can see this panel resize actually lives next to it, but it's resizing this panel, right? But it lives next to it because we actually use this variable other places. We'll get to that. But the point is that this needs to know where to place itself. So it uses the width for that, right? And then in this case, we have, let's just say, we have this left attribute here that changes the position, right? I hope that all makes sense. I'm kind of also working it out as we go along. So if everything doesn't 100% clear, it's because I'm also reading through it as we go, right? So now we kind of have 2 options because we need a version of this that basically works almost exactly the same, but works for the right side of the screen. And there's essentially 2 options. We can either say, I want to pass in an attribute that says like side, and then we can change this to like right or left, and we can just default it to left, right? So we can say what side should it be, and then we just have to go through internally and update all the logic so it could be either left or right. The other option is to basically just change the component, duplicate the component to have a right total right panel resizer. Which one should you choose kind of generally? Because this is kind of a more common problem of like, should I modify my component to be more flexible? to handle another use case, or should I create a separate component that's like the first one but for this use case? And there's almost never the answer is not simple. It really depends on the case. So in this case, I think I would give it an attribute, because in my head, and I'm not sure I'm right yet, but I think the amount of logic change we need to make, I don't think it's so bad. So that's my guess. So I'm going to add this attribute called side, and I'm going to change it to the default value is going to, actually our test value is going to be right for now. And the basic idea here is that if the, or actually we'll do it differently. We'll call it right side. No, just right. And we'll say the default is true. So we could just leave light. Like it doesn't really matter if we say side, left, right, or right equals true. It's just that right kind of indicates that it's a Boolean, and then it's easier to understand. If we said a side and you had to type in left or right, maybe it would be less obvious for the user. Actually, know what? I'm changing my mind again. I think it should be side, and I think it should be right, like this. We can just make it case insensitive to be a little bit more forgiving. I think that's still, in my head, that makes more sense to have a side, left and right. Okay, yes, this might happen a few times, because you don't always know what the best option is ahead of time. So if I change my mind a lot, well, that's just part of how I generally work. Okay, so now we have a side. What do we need to change for this panel resizer to respect the size? Well, I think the first one is we have this width attribute, which we are using, or the style variable, not attribute, comes from the attribute, right? It adds 27. Okay, that's to make it a little bit, a little bit stand out from the size. That's probably I'm guessing that's the width. It's not quite the width. Okay. I don't know why it's 27, but it seems to work. So we're gonna assume that magic number was discovered by some testing. So we're gonna leave the 22nd for now, right? 27 for now, right? But what we want is that if this is the right side, then we shouldn't set the left property to 127. We should set the right property to 127, right? So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to add a new class to this. We're going to call it right, and it's going to be if the side lowercase equals right. And what I'm basically doing here is saying, like, I'm being a little bit forgiving. If you type like uppercase right or capitalized right, it still works. But if you type anything else, it defaults to left. And I think that's probably a pretty good medium between, like, you have to be deliberate and saying, no, I want the right side. But also, I mean, it's not too difficult. And if you accidentally spelled it with a capital letter, it doesn't care. And actually, since I expect I'll be using this exact formula more than once, I'm going to go and copy that. I'm going to create a formula and I'm going to say is right side question mark. And we're just going to paste that in here, because now we have a formula here we can use called is right side, and I can just go and change that is right side. All right. Now I can reuse that formula later on, which I know I will need to, right? Okay, so if this, we'll go and add a style for that called right. And what we're saying, right, that's okay. And if we are in right, then left is auto, and right is our, width, right? So now this should be like, if we are on the right side, with, like, if we got the side right attribute, then the width will be used on the right instead of the left. That should be fine. So everything else around how this clicking works should be fine, right? There's nothing here that indicates that this should work differently. We're still setting an X coordinate. I still think that makes perfect sense. Again, we're closing by setting the cursor state pressed false. If that, I don't really know if that's technically ever gonna happen, that we trigger that event, but it doesn't matter. In this case, we have the mouse up, and again, this doesn't really matter if it's left or right. We're just changing the pressed right. So let's go to the mouse move, right? And this absolutely does matter, right? Because what's happening here is we want to change this formula based on we're left or right, right? So if we're on the left side, this works. If we're on the right side, we want to do different math. We're basically saying, and we'll see if I can do the math right, and there's a good chance that I won't get it right, and we'll end up going and testing it, and it doesn't work. But we're going to try it out. We're going to be bold and see if we can get it right the first time. Otherwise, we'll have to come back and fix it. Okay. So if the mouse move right now minus the starting point, right? So the cursor state X is where was the mouse when we pressed it down, right? So if we move to the right, it's going to be the difference between that starting point and the new one. And I feel like if we're on the right side, it'll just be the same times -1, because essentially if we moved it 10 pixels to the right, it would be the equivalent of moving it 10 pixels to the left, right? So plus just becomes minus. So in this case, I'm going to multiply, and then I'm going to say if is right side, then -1. Oh, -1, -2 would have been interesting. Otherwise, 1. In my head, that works. We'll see if I'm right. But it basically says, take the distance you traveled, and if this is a right side resize panel, then actually invert it. So minus, that means right becomes left, and left becomes right. Okay. I don't know if that works, but we'll try it. We can't test this component in here in its own, because it relies on a bunch of attributes here, right? And actually the width one is the one that gets triggered as you move. And as a result, we really don't have an easy way of testing it here. So we have to test it in context. So I'm going to go, actually, if we look at the project sidebar, let's look at how the current one is set up, right? So this one actually gets its width from, okay, that's a hard-coded number. That makes sense. Same with min width. That, okay, yeah, because we only need to set it here. Side is not set. That's okay, because we know that if you don't set side, we just created it, so obviously it isn't set. If you don't set side, we default, I keep kicking my camera, there we are. We default to left. That's also fine. And width actually comes from an attribute passed in called sidebar width. Okay, so this project sidebar component doesn't actually control, it doesn't own the variable where we store the width. It's being passed in as an attribute, and therefore we can probably predict that in the event when we change it, yeah, it triggers. Oh, we've got a bit of a CSS issue here, right? It actually triggers this event up, right? So now we get to go one level up, and the component above this, actually we can do this a different way. Just I happen to know what the component above it is, so therefore I could just search for the editor page, but you can also go down to the bottom of your right panel and say dependents, and then you click this and you can see all the components that depend on this one. In this case, it's the editor page. So that's a nice little way of quickly finding out the sort of relationships between components and Totle, right? Right. So in this case, we've got our project sidebar here, and it's getting some attributes like the sidebar width. That was the one we cared about. And where does that come from? Okay, so this component, the editor page, actually has a variable called sidebar width that defines the width of the sidebar. And we can also see when we say sidebar width change, what does it do? It actually just updates the sidebar width, right? Okay, so when we resize this sidebar, what we're really doing is we're updating a variable inside the editor page called sidebar width, right? So now comes the question, what are we going to do for the right sidebar? Do we want to do the same thing? And I actually don't think we want to do it exactly the same way, because the reason why the variable here lives in the editor page is because we have we both use it to resize the actual element panel here, but it also resizes the whole project sidebar. So it both works for the element panel here on the left and for the sidebar. For this right panel and this sidebar, it works across not just the component editor, but also right here we can see right now the editor formula loaded up, the formula editor and any of the other ones, right? So it makes sense that that variables lives all the way up at the editor page, which is the highest, like that's the page level of our editor, right? It makes sense it lives there because it's fairly high up, but we don't really need that for the right panel because that only works inside the component editor. So we can see inside this, we have this component editor. We click into that. This is our main editor view, right? This is the one where we're mainly building our app. And what we want to resize here is actually on the right. I'm going to move myself over again. I'm probably going to be a bit moving back and forth, right? So we can see here on our right side, we have this div right here, which, and we've got a show formula for that. This says, okay, it's only if we're in the side mode, not in test mode. That makes sense. If we go to test mode, it goes away. But this div right here actually wraps all of the elements here. And if we look at the styling, this actually has absolute, positioned, and it doesn't have a dictated width, because I think they're dictated in each of these. So if we go into the element panel, my guess is that this, yeah, that has a fixed width, and all the other ones have, right? So what I think we want to do here is, I think actually we want to move our, we want to go here and then have our resize total panel resizer here. I think we're gonna set the side right for that. And what should the min width max width be? Well, what were they on the other one? Project sidebar. Oh, we'll just see what they were here, right? Oh, there we are. 800 and 270. I think 270 is probably fine. 800 is almost certainly too little. So total panel resizer, min width 270, max width 800, and then I think I want to make the variable here actually inside the components, because this right panel only lives inside the components. It doesn't live anywhere else. If we have a right panel in another part, like if we add one, for example, for like the formula editor at some point, I think it'll conceptually probably be different, a different panel. I don't think you would want the resize settings from one to spill over to the other. So in this case, we're going to go in here. You can see we've got quite a lot of attributes here. Going back again. So we're going to create a new variable called right panel with, and we're going to set the initial to 300, because I can't remember what it's supposed to be. So we'll set it to 300 and we can always fix the default later. Now actually let's do it properly, like editor page, right? We'll just see. It's called sidebar width 272. Okay, well that was fair enough. So we'll set this right panel width to 272. Right, that'll be a default, right? Okay. So, whoop. This does like now lie on top of it, and that's probably because none of this size really respects the width of the panel resize, right? Well, first of all, we should actually bind this width to be our right panel width. Okay, so that actually helped a lot already, right? And the other bit we want to do with that, is, of course, that when we actually change it, we want to update our right panel width to be that new value, right? Okay, done. So this does kind of work now in the sense that, you know, we get to move it up and down. I think 800 is a pretty extreme for this. So actually anything sort of above this size, what are we around here? I don't think we would ever really want that. I think it does make sense to limit it a little bit. So let's have a look at what that variable value was. Where are we here? Right panel width. Right now it's at 490. So I think maybe we'll set the max. Where do I hit it? We'll set the max at 500 for this, because I think 800 is a bit silly. Right. So now we've added our panel resizer to the right side, and it is it is working, but the problem is that right now we haven't like asked any of these to respect the size, right? It's just kind of there, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure this outer containing div is the one that actually care about the size, and that's the actual resize. And then we're going to change all of these other things to just be 100% wide, because then they'll automatically stretch the right size, and we'll only have to actually set the size one place. So here we're going to add a style variable called width, just like we kind of have inside, and then this will be the right panel width. And we don't need to add 27, the magic number, because we did that inside. We still don't really know why, but I mean, if it works, we don't need to dig too much into it, right? So now we're setting the right panel width, right, as a style variable, and then here we want to set width to be equals to width, right? That means as we're dragging this, things are beginning to happen. Not exactly the things we wanted to happen, but we're getting closer. Okay, so we can see what's going on now is that as I'm dragging this panel, the div resizes, but the element panel inside doesn't. Let's go and click on that. That's probably because this is hard-coded. If we change this to 100%, now we're talking, right? Let's go back and have a look. Now, if I'm going to test mode, dragging this, my element panel is beautifully being resized. Now, in order to switch to attribute, unfortunately, I can't actually click the link because that's part of routing and actually isn't controlled by this component. So what I have to do instead is I can go in and say, we're calling it no left panel mode, no right panel, right? So that's style. If I change that to attributes, we'll switch to the attributes tab, right? And we can see, that kind of almost worked, but not quite. Actually, this is still inside the element panel, right? So I think here, isn't it? Element attributes. That's the one panel we actually. This looks super messy, right? And I get why, because there's a lot of like things lumped inside. But what we actually want is this element attribute panels, right? And all we need to do here is the same thing. It was hard coded to. Actually, we can just clear it. We don't even need to, because it automatically fits the width, right? That works too. Let's get back to our. Okay. So let's since this is kind of difficult to test, and that sometimes happen where you have components that are depending on state in other components, and therefore testing them in isolation can be quite difficult. Sometimes it makes sense to just actually go and test them live. So what I'm going to do here is actually I'm going to take my my branch name, and I'm going to move it down here before Totle. So what that actually does, and this only works, well, actually technically works in any project, but it specifically works in the Totle project, is that when I put this name before, I'm actually loading this branch, the editor for this branch. So now when I'm editing my project, this is actually the one I'm editing. And you can see, because right here, we've got our resize panel already working in the outer editor, right? I hope you're following. So we've got the version we're editing, right? Which is right here. Now, as I'm editing, nothing changes, but every time I refresh the editor, those changes I made inside will actually apply to the brands I'm currently on, which is quite nice, because then it's generally easier to test these things in context. And by that I mean, when you have the whole setup going, you can get a better feel for is it actually working, right? When I'm testing inside here, well, I mean, there we are. Like when I'm testing, okay, it works for style, but I also want to test attributes and events. That's kind of just easier when I'm here, right? Okay, so my resize works for style. What about attributes? Yes, that also seems to work. What about events? Are we still happy? Okay, events also work. So now I think everything in style panel does seem to work as it should. And I think, yeah, so far so good. We do have a little bit of these popovers now popping up inside of this, but why? Because they were kind of ideally popping up at the left. I'm not sure I dislike that so much, because I also feel like if you already resized it, do you really want it to pop up like and take up even more space? So I mean, logically we would move them to always pop out here, but at the same time I'm not really sure as a user I would want that, or I would prefer them. Maybe I do want them to pop over. We'll delay that decision, but maybe we don't necessarily want to fix that now. Maybe there's nothing to fix. It's kind of a matter of taste, I think, of what would you prefer, and we'll run that by the rest of the team. Have people make a call by the end of the video, right? Okay, so we now have one that works for most scenarios, but we see it doesn't work for these. This data panel, which is what we call this over here. So if we look at here, we've got our element panel, component panel, text panel, slot panel. We've got a lot of different panels, and we actually need to test all of them to make sure they work. But the one we can see right now isn't working is this one, the data panel. So let's first take this div. This has a hard-coded width. Let's get rid of that. Right, that helped a bit. And then we have data panel, and we can kind of see as we click it that it has a hard-coded width as well. Let's dive into that. And again, we've got this width. The 68 is kind of a legacy thing in Totle. We used to have this units concept where you could say 68 and it would be in units of 4 pixels. Turned out nobody understood it and nobody liked it, so we got rid of it. But there are still, because the Totle project dates way back, there are still examples of this still floating around. Okay, so we deleted the width, and the default is auto. That means 100%. Therefore, this should now work. Let's go give that a refresh, because as I said, when we refresh the browser, the changes I just made inside the editor actually applies to the outside editor. So now if I start doing this and resizing, okay, we're actually getting a nice resized component here, right? Right, so it looks like our resizing of the right panel works pretty well. We kind of have the same thing here where these new dialogues overlap a bit. I'm not sure if maybe we'll fix that later. Maybe we do need to fix it later. But this seems to work. Let's go back to our component editor, see what else do we have. We need to test the component panel, text panel, and slot panel, right? Now, obviously, I think most of you probably have no idea what that means. Text panel is when you select text, we show a different right panel. And if I resize that, we can see that didn't work. Let's jump into the text panel. It's probably exactly the same. We're very happy with this absolute styling setting a fixed width. Like, the reason why we do this in a lot of these components, actually, it does kind of make sense, because you want to design it, at least initially. If you know it's going to be fixed width, it's kind of nicer to just always look at the right size and not be dependent on what, like this doesn't really look like what's going to look like. That's why we set a fixed width on everything, right? But now that we're resizing, we need to undo that. So we're going back. Let's just quickly check. We'll just check slot panel. Yeah, it has the same thing. That makes sense. And that's it. We should have everything. So let's do a refresh. Right. So now first we've got the resize with the attribute or data panel. That looks pretty good. If I select an HTML element, I can switch between tabs. I can resize some more. If I select the component, ooh, no component panel, not working. Let's go and get component panel. So this looks actually like this looks the same as the element panel, but because components and elements actually are quite different underneath, we have two separate panels, because the way the events tab works, the way attributes, the way everything works is a little bit different. So they actually are different panels. They just look the same. But again, that's why we need to kill this width. And it looks like if we do that, let's give it a refresh, test again. Right, let's have a look. Component, how does that work when we start resizing? Looks pretty good. Okay, so the attributes part of component needs to be fixed, and events is fine, right? But attributes needs to be fixed. Okay. Oops, let's go back to our component panel. Okay, so component panel has a component attributes, and we can see that's the one that's too narrow, right? This div is fine. Component attribute. What about event? Okay, we can't see that here. Component attributes, same deal again. There was a fixed width on it. Once we fix that, the rest kind of falls in. And we're refreshing and testing again. Right, here we are. Attributes now works. This is exactly the thing we were trying to fix. Is 500, and maybe we do need to make it a little bit wider than 500 actually. Maybe this is not enough to resize. We would say 800 here. Yeah, I mean, we might as well let people resize to 800, right? Like, it's kind of better to be able to than not to. So we'll go back to the component editor. We'll, on this one, the resizer, we'll set 800. Right. So, I think we'll probably end it here, and I'll send this off to the rest of the team to get tested and verified and see, do they think this makes sense. I think we'll probably end up fixing it so that these little boxes, these little draggable editors, actually respect the current width when they pop out. Right now, they're kind of, again, hard-coded. We often say when it has a fixed value, they're fixed to a specific width. They should probably adopt the resize width. I think makes sense. So I might go and change that afterwards. But for now, we added the resizer. We copied it over from the other one, modified it to work on the right side, and then we've adjusted the layout and styling of all these panels so it works with our resize panel, right? So thank you very much for watching. I hope this was informative and show you just a little bit about what it's like to work inside Totle in a really large project. And again, also a project that has some legacy stuff in it, right? Where not everything has been updated to the latest units, etc. But that's super normal. As projects grow, these are the kind of things you end up dealing with a bit, right? And it's kind of what Totle is all about. It's about letting you build projects that can get really, really big and really, really complex, but you can still manage that complexity. You can still keep working and building stuff really, really fast. So yeah, I hope you liked the video. If you haven't tried Totle yet, go and give it a try on toddle.dev. You can try it for free. You don't even need to sign up. You can just open the editor and start playing around. Yeah, subscribe to the videos if you want to see more content like this. Thank you very much.